carriage stopped with a hard jolt, and Elena Whitmore nearly slid off the seat. Nobody reached out to steady her. Lady Constance Reed was already climbing down, her skirts lifted with practiced grace, her eyes fixed on the glowing windows of Ashby Hall. Elena followed a step behind, the way she always did, carrying a small bag that was not even her own. "Do not wander," said Lord Edmund Reed without turning his head. "You are here to assist my daughter, not to be seen." Elena nodded, though no one was watching her nod. She had learned, over the past 2 years living under her uncle's roof, that silence was safer than argument. Her parents were gone, her home was gone. What remained was this arrangement, this quiet exchange of shelter for obedience, and she accepted it because there was nothing else to accept. The entrance hall of Ashby Hall glittered with candlelight. Musicians tuned their instruments somewhere beyond a set of tall doors, and the sound of laughter rolled through the corridor like a wave that never quite reached her. Elena straightened the plain gray dress she wore, the only one suitable for such an evening, and followed her aunt and cousin toward the ballroom. The moment they entered, Constance transformed. Her posture lifted, her smile bloomed, and heads turned in her direction, as though she had rehearsed the entrance 100 times. Perhaps she had. Elena had watched her cousin practice in front of mirrors for weeks, perfecting the tilt of her chin, the exact moment to lower her lashes. No one turned to look at Elena. She was not dressed to be noticed, and she had long ago stopped expecting it. She found a chair near the far wall, half hidden behind a tall arrangement of white flowers, and sat down before anyone could tell her to move somewhere less visible. From there, she could see everything. The ballroom stretched wide beneath 3 enormous chandeliers, each one dripping with candlelight that turned every gown into something made of gold. Ladies in blue and rose and ivory drifted between clusters of gentlemen, their laughter light and careful, their eyes always scanning the room for something better than what stood in front of them. Elena did not mind watching. She had grown skilled at it. Watching cost nothing, asked nothing, and revealed everything. She noticed the young officer who kept glancing toward the door as though waiting for someone who might never come. She noticed the older woman in violet silk who complimented every dress in the room while gripping her fan so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She noticed her cousin, already surrounded by 3 gentlemen, tilting her head at exactly the angle that made her curls catch the light. "You look like you are counting the candles instead of enjoying the music," said a voice beside her. Elena turned, startled, to find a woman perhaps twice her age settling into the empty chair beside her. She had kind eyes and silver hair pinned loosely at the back of her head, and she wore a dress far simpler than most in the room, as though she had chosen comfort over spectacle. "I did not realize anyone would notice," Elena said. "I notice everything, my dear. It is the curse of growing old at these events. You stop watching the dancers and start watching the ones who are not dancing." The woman extended a gloved hand. "Margaret, I knew your mother many years ago, before you were born." Elena's chest tightened at the mention of her mother, a subject she rarely heard spoken aloud anymore. "You knew her. We were girls together in the countryside, before she married your father and moved away. She had your same quiet way of watching a room before she ever stepped into it." Margaret smiled, though there was something sad behind it. "I was sorry to hear what happened to your family. Truly sorry." "Thank you," Elena said softly, unsure what else there was to say. Gratitude for sympathy always felt strange to her, like accepting a gift she had not asked for and could not return. "Your aunt keeps you close but does not let you shine," Margaret observed, her gaze drifting toward Constance across the room. "That is a particular kind of unkindness, I think, to bring a bird to a garden and never let it fly." Elena said nothing. There was truth in the words, but speaking it aloud felt disloyal, even toward people who had shown her little loyalty of their own. A sudden hush moved through the ballroom, beginning near the entrance and spreading outward like ripples on water. Conversations dimmed. Even the musicians seemed to play a fraction softer, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Elena looked toward the doors and saw him. He was tall, dressed in black that seemed darker than anyone else's black, and he moved through the crowd without hurrying, without smiling, without acknowledging the way every eye in the room had turned toward him at once. His expression was composed, almost bored, as though he had attended 1,000 balls exactly like this one, and found nothing in any of them worth his attention. "The Duke of Ashby," Margaret said quietly, though there was no need to explain further. Everyone in the room already knew. Nathaniel Ashby. This is his family's home, and this ball was arranged, they say, to celebrate his return from abroad, though I suspect the true purpose is to parade every eligible young woman within 100 miles in front of him. He does not look pleased about it, Elena observed. He never does. They say he has not smiled at a ball in 3 years, not since his father passed and the title fell to him. Some believe grief hardened him. Others believe he was always this way, and grief only gave him an excuse. Margaret studied Elena's face for a moment. You are the only person in this room not straightening your posture at the sight of him. Elena had not realized she had remained perfectly still while half the ballroom adjusted itself in anticipation. She glanced down at her plain dress and gave a small, humorless smile. There is little point in straightening for a man who will never look this direction. Across the room, Lord Reed had already spotted the Duke and was maneuvering Constance toward him, with the subtlety of a general moving troops into position. Constance's laugh rose above the general murmur of the crowd, bright and deliberate, clearly meant to carry. The Duke's gaze passed over her without pausing. It passed over the room entirely, sweeping across gowns and jewels and eager smiles with the same flat indifference, until it reached the far wall where the flowers stood tall beside a chair mostly hidden in shadow. For half a second his eyes met Elena's. She felt it like a small shock, unexpected and sharp, and she looked away first, certain she had imagined the pause, certain a man like that would never truly notice a woman like her. When she glanced back, he had already turned to greet his host, his expression unreadable once more. Interesting, Margaret murmured, almost to herself. What is? Elena asked. Nothing, my dear, only an old woman noticing things she has no business noticing. Margaret patted Elena's hand and rose from her chair. I must go pay my respects to the hostess before she scolds me for hiding in the corner. Will you be well here alone? I am always well alone, Elena said, and meant it as reassurance rather than complaint, though even to her own ears it sounded a little like both. Margaret left, and Elena returned to watching the room, though something in her had shifted, some small, unsettled feeling she could not name. She told herself it was nothing. Dukes did not notice companions in gray dresses. Dukes noticed women like Constance, women who knew how to be noticed. The evening moved forward in its usual rhythm. Dancers formed lines and turned in careful patterns while Elena remained at the edge of it all, a silent witness to a celebration that was not hers to enjoy. She watched Lord Reed introduce Constance to the Duke with an elaborate bow, watched Constance curtsy so low it seemed designed to draw attention to the shine of her gown, watched the Duke offer only the briefest, coolest greeting in return, before turning his attention elsewhere. A young man approached the flowers near Elena's chair, close enough that she noticed him before he spoke. He was younger than the Duke, with an easier face and warmer eyes, dressed just as finely but carrying himself with none of the same distance. You have chosen the best seat in the house, he said, gesturing toward the view of the ballroom. From here, you can see everyone and everything, and no one bothers to look back. Is that meant as a compliment or an observation? Elena asked, unsure whether to be wary of him. Both, I think. I am Henry Ashby, the Duke's younger brother, and terribly guilty of the same habit of watching from corners, though I am rarely brave enough to sit still while doing it. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way his brother's expression across the room had not managed all evening. May I ask your name? Elena Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. He inclined his head politely. I noticed my brother's eyes pause on this side of the room a moment ago. That is a rare event, I assure you. Nathaniel does not pause for anyone. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks and hoped the dim light near the flowers hit it well enough. I am certain it was nothing. Perhaps he was admiring the flowers. Henry laughed, a genuine sound that turned a few nearby heads. Perhaps, though I have known my brother 30 years, and I have never once seen him admire flowers. Before Elena could respond, a servant approached Henry with a quiet message, and he excused himself with an apologetic bow, promising to return before the night ended. Elena watched him go, then let her gaze drift back toward the center of the room, where Constance was now dancing with a gentleman in a red coat, her laughter still calculated, still carrying. The Duke stood near the refreshment table, a glass in hand that he had not touched, listening to an older gentleman speak with the same flat patience he had shown all evening. And then, for the briefest moment, his eyes lifted again, crossing the length of the ballroom, and found her once more. This time Elena did not look away first, neither did he. The moment held longer than it should have, long enough that Elena felt her heartbeat quicken in a way she did not fully understand, long enough that the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. Then the older gentleman beside him said something that required a response, and the Duke's attention returned to the conversation, leaving Elena alone again with the strange, unfamiliar feeling that she had just been seen for the first time in a very long while. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like the Duke of Ashby did not notice women like her, not truly, not in any way that mattered. Whatever had passed between them was surely a trick of candlelight and imagination, nothing more. But as the musicians began preparing for the first formal dance of the evening, and the crowd began arranging itself with the practiced anticipation of people who knew something important was about to happen, Elena found she could not stop watching the tall figure in black standing near the center of the room. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the years of quiet obedience and careful invisibility, a small and unfamiliar hope began to stir. The first dance had not yet begun, but the ballroom already felt like a held breath. Servants moved along the edges refilling glasses, and the musicians shifted their instruments in preparation, yet every conversation seemed to circle back to the same subject. Would the Duke dance tonight? Would he choose anyone at all? Last year he had stood through the entire evening without once stepping onto the floor, and the year before that he had left before midnight without a single word of farewell. Lord Reed had built his entire strategy around tonight being different. He stood near a marble pillar with Constance at his side, speaking to her in a low voice that Elena, still seated near the flowers, could not quite hear, though she could guess its shape well enough. Smile more. Stand taller. Do not let him speak to anyone else first. He has not danced in 3 years, a woman nearby whispered to her companion, fanning herself with visible excitement. If he chooses someone tonight, it will be the talk of every drawing room in the county by morning. My money is on Lady Constance, the companion replied. Her father has been planning this for months. I heard he paid for half the flowers in this room just to impress the Duke's household staff. Elena listened without meaning to, the way she listened to most things, absorbing details that were not hers to keep. She thought of Constance's careful laughter, her practiced curtsy, the months of preparation that had gone into a single evening, and felt a small ache of something that was not quite envy but was not entirely separate from it either. It must be a particular kind of comfort, she thought, to have people invest so much effort into your happiness. She could not remember the last time anyone had planned anything for her sake. The Duke moved through the crowd again, this time with his brother Henry beside him, the two of them speaking in low tones that occasionally drew a small, reluctant smile from Nathaniel's otherwise composed face. Elena found herself watching the shape of that smile, wondering what kind of brother could coax warmth from a man everyone else described as cold. He is different with Henry, Margaret said, returning to the seat beside Elena with 2 glasses of lemonade, offering one without asking whether Elena wanted it. Family softens him, I think, though he guards against showing it to anyone else. Grief does strange things to a person. It can make them louder, or it can make them into a locked door. You speak as though you understand him well, Elena said, accepting the glass gratefully. I understand loss, my dear, and that is often enough to understand a person who carries it. Margaret took a slow sip of her own drink. His father died suddenly, you know. A fall from a horse, they say. Though there was talk for a time that it was something else entirely. Nathaniel was only 26 when the title came to him, far younger than most men are prepared for such weight. I imagine he learned quickly that warmth invites people who only want something from you. Elena thought of her own losses, the fire that had taken her parents and the home she had grown up in, the sudden collapse of a life she had once taken for granted. She understood, perhaps better than most in this glittering room, what it meant to have warmth stripped away too soon, and to build something harder in its place simply to survive. Across the floor, Lord Reed had finally maneuvered Constance directly into the Duke's path, positioning her so that his path forward would require either acknowledgement or open rudeness. Nathaniel paused, offered a brief bow, and exchanged a few words that Elena could not hear, but that made Constance's smile widen with visible triumph. There, Margaret murmured, the opening move. But the Duke did not linger. Within moments he had excused himself with practiced courtesy, and continued on his path across the room, leaving Constance to recover her composure, while her father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Henry appeared again near Elena's chair, this time without an excuse to leave hovering over him. He glanced toward his brother, then back toward Elena, an odd thoughtfulness in his expression. May I ask you something, Miss Whitmore? Of course. Do you dance? The question caught her off guard. I have not danced at a formal event in some years, not since before my parents passed. There has not been much occasion for it since. Something in Henry's expression softened, though he did not press for details she had not offered. That seems a shame. A room like this deserves more dancers who actually wish to be here, rather than those performing for an audience. I do not think anyone would ask a companion in a gray dress to dance, Elena said, not with bitterness but with the plain honesty of someone who had long ago stopped expecting otherwise. You might be surprised, Henry said, and there was something in his tone that made Elena look at him more closely, though before she could ask what he meant, he was called away again by a passing acquaintance, leaving her once more with only her thoughts and the ever-present hum of the ballroom around her. The musicians began a slow, deliberate tuning that signaled the first formal dance was approaching. Servants moved to clear a wider space at the center of the floor, and the crowd began arranging itself instinctively, forming a loose circle around the open area where the first pair would step forward and set the evening properly in motion. Elena watched Constance smooth the front of her gown for what must have been the 10th time that hour, watched Lord Reed whisper something final into his daughter's ear, watched the entire Reed family brace itself for a moment they believed had already been secured through months of careful planning. She did not expect anything for herself. She had come to accept over 2 long years that evenings like this belonged to people like Constance, women born into families that valued them, women whose smiles opened doors rather than merely decorating rooms they were permitted to enter. Elena's role tonight, as on every night before it, was simply to watch, to remain quiet, to take up as little space as possible until it was time to go home. And yet, despite herself, she felt her pulse quicken as the musicians lifted their instruments and the room fell into an expectant hush. Somewhere near the center of the floor, the Duke of Ashby stood alone, his expression unreadable, his gaze sweeping slowly across the assembled crowd as though searching for something, or someone, that no one else in the room had yet guessed. Elena told herself firmly not to hope. Hope had betrayed her before, in smaller ways and larger ones, and she had learned that it was safer to expect nothing than to be disappointed by wanting too much. She folded her hands in her lap, lowered her eyes toward the polished floor, and waited, like everyone else, to see who the cold Duke of Ashby would choose. Elena noticed, as the crowd began arranging itself, that Henry had returned to stand near the edge of the circle, close enough that she could see him watching his brother with an expression of quiet expectation. He caught her eye briefly and offered a small nod, as though confirming something he had suspected all along, though Elena could not begin to guess what that something might be. Margaret leaned closer, her voice low. "Whatever happens in the next few moments, my dear, remember that you owe this room nothing. Not your comfort, not your smile, not your gratitude for being noticed or overlooked. You are permitted simply to exist here, exactly as you are." Elena appreciated the words even as her heart continued to race, though she could not fully explain why the coming moment felt so significant, so heavy with possibility, when logic told her plainly that nothing about it truly concerned her at all. Dukes chose partners from among the daughters of earls and viscounts, women whose families could offer land, connections, and fortune in exchange for a title. A companion in a borrowed gray dress had no place in such calculations, however briefly a pair of steady eyes had lingered on her across a crowded room. Near the center of the floor, Constance shifted her weight impatiently, glancing sideways at her father as though seeking reassurance that their careful plan remained intact. Lord Reed offered a tight, encouraging smile in return, though Elena noticed the faint tension at the corners of his mouth, the tiny flicker of doubt he could not quite suppress despite months of confident preparation. The silence stretched a moment longer than seemed natural. Even the musicians appeared to hesitate, their bows lifted but not yet moving, as though the entire room understood that something unusual was about to happen and did not wish to rush it. Lord Reed's hand tightened briefly around his daughter's arm, a silent instruction to be ready. Constance lifted her chin, arranging her features into the perfect expression of pleased surprise she had surely practiced for this exact moment. The Duke took a single step forward. Every eye in the ballroom followed him, tracking his path with the same breathless anticipation, certain they already knew where that path would end. Constance's smile grew, her posture straightened, and for one full second it seemed the entire evening would unfold exactly as her father had planned. But the Duke did not stop where the crowd expected him to stop. He continued walking, past the cluster of eager young women near the center of the floor, past Constance's carefully arranged smile, past the whispers already beginning to rise around the edges of the room, his path bending instead toward the far wall, toward the tall white flowers, toward the chair where a young woman in a plain gray dress sat with her hands folded quietly in her lap, entirely unaware that the entire room had just turned to watch her. Elena did not notice him at first. She was still watching the crowd near the center of the floor, still waiting like everyone else to see which woman would be chosen, when a shadow fell across her lap, and the murmuring around her seemed to grow suddenly, strangely loud. She looked up. The Duke of Ashby stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the faint lines of tiredness beneath his composed expression, close enough to notice that his eyes, which had seemed so distant and cold from across the room, were simply guarded rather than empty. He extended a gloved hand toward her, palm upward, and said nothing at first, as though he expected her to understand without words. "Your Grace," Elena managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe there has been some mistake." "There has been no mistake," he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying none of the practiced charm she had heard other gentlemen use throughout the evening. "Will you dance with me, Miss Whitmore?" The sound of her own name in his mouth startled her more than the invitation itself. She had not told him her name. She had not spoken to him at all. Somewhere behind her, she was certain, Henry Ashby was watching with an expression that was not quite as innocent as it should have been. Across the room, the silence had grown absolute. Elena could feel dozens of eyes fixed upon her, could feel the weight of Constance's stunned expression, could sense Lord Reed's fury simmering just beneath the surface of his frozen smile. Every part of her wanted to refuse, to shrink back into the safety of invisibility she had built so carefully over 2 long years. It would be easier to decline, to let the Duke find someone more suitable, someone who belonged in this room the way she never had. But there was something in his eyes, some quiet steadiness that did not match the whispers she had heard about him all evening, and before she fully understood her own decision, Elena placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, and he led her toward the center of the floor as the crowd parted before them in stunned silence. Elena felt every gaze in the room settle upon her plain gray dress, her simple hair, her lack of jewels or ribbons or any of the small ornaments that marked the other women present as worthy of such attention. She kept her chin lifted only because lowering it felt like surrender, and surrender, in this moment, felt worse than fear. The musicians, sensing the moment had finally arrived, began to play. The Duke's hand settled at her waist with careful formality, his other hand still holding hers, and they began to move together through the opening steps of the dance. Elena had not danced in years, not since long before the fire that had taken everything from her, but her body remembered the patterns even as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. "You seem surprised," the Duke said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "I am astonished, Your Grace. I do not understand why you would choose me. Perhaps because you were the only person in this room not trying to be chosen." His expression remained composed, but there was something almost wry in the set of his mouth. "Everyone else has spent the evening performing. You alone seemed content simply to watch." "Watching is safer than performing," Elena admitted before she could stop herself. "I have found it usually ends with less disappointment." Something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite name, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "That is a rather guarded philosophy for someone so young. I have had cause to learn it." They turned together through the next figure of the dance, and Elena became aware, gradually, of the whispers rising around the edges of the ballroom, a low current of astonishment and speculation that followed their every movement. She caught fragments as they passed near clusters of onlookers. "Who is she? I have never seen her before tonight. Surely this cannot be serious." She kept her eyes fixed on the Duke rather than the crowd, partly out of necessity, and partly because meeting his gaze felt steadier than facing the sea of judgment surrounding them. "They are talking about us," she said. "They are always talking about something," he replied, unbothered. "Tonight it simply happens to be us. Does it not concern you? What they might say? I stopped concerning myself with ballroom gossip some years ago, Miss Whitmore. It rarely has anything useful to offer." He guided her through a slow turn, his hand steady at her waist. "Though I confess I am curious what concerns you. You seem far more troubled by their whispers than I am." Elena considered how to answer honestly without revealing too much of herself to a stranger, however kind his manner seemed in this moment. "I have spent 2 years being told, in various ways, that I do not belong in rooms like this one. It is difficult to unlearn that lesson in the space of a single dance." The Duke's expression shifted, something more serious replacing the earlier wryness. "Who told you that you did not belong?" Elena glanced instinctively toward the edge of the room, where her uncle stood rigid with barely restrained anger, where Constance's face had gone pale with humiliation, where her aunt watched the scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between horror and calculation. "It does not matter," Elena said quietly. "It is not a conversation for a ballroom." "Perhaps not," the Duke agreed, though something in his expression suggested he had already drawn his own conclusions from the tension he had observed on the far side of the room. "Then let us speak instead of something lighter. Tell me one thing you enjoyed before the world became so complicated for you." The question caught Elena off guard, and she found herself smiling despite the strangeness of the evening. "I used to read to my father in the evenings. He preferred stories about distant places, the sort of tales that made the whole world feel larger than the small corner of it we actually occupied. I have not read aloud to anyone since. Then perhaps you shall have occasion to again, Nathaniel said, and though the words were simple, something in the way he said them suggested more meaning than the sentence alone could carry. They moved through another turn, and Elena became gradually aware that dancing with him had begun to feel less like an ordeal to survive, and more like a conversation she did not wish to end. The music seemed to slow the world around them, softening the whispers at the edges of the room into something distant and unimportant, leaving only the steady rhythm of their steps and the low, careful cadence of his voice. "You dance well, for someone who claims not to have practiced in years," he observed. "My mother insisted I learn properly, before everything changed. She used to say a woman should always know how to move gracefully through a room, even when she felt entirely out of place within it." Elena's voice softened at the memory. "I did not expect to use that lesson again so soon." "I am glad you did," Nathaniel said simply. The Duke followed her glance, and something in his expression hardened almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing more on the subject as the music carried them through the remaining steps of the dance. Elena found herself grateful for his silence, grateful that he did not press for details she was not prepared to share with a man she had known for less than a quarter of an hour. As the dance drew toward its close, the Duke's hand tightened slightly around hers, not painfully, but with a firmness that suggested he did not intend to release her the moment the music ended. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her, "I do not typically act on impulse. My brother would tell you I am, in fact, the least impulsive man he knows. Yet something about the way you sat apart from all of this tonight, quiet and unhurried, unwilling to perform for anyone, struck me as worth understanding." Elena's heart beat unsteadily against her ribs. "I fear you may find little worth understanding, Your Grace. My circumstances are quite ordinary, quite plain." "I doubt that very much." The music slowed toward its final notes, and the Duke guided her through the last turn with the same careful precision he had shown throughout. "Would you permit me to speak with you again before the evening ends? Somewhere quieter than this?" Before Elena could answer, the final note of the dance rang out, and the room erupted into a wave of applause and murmured commentary that swallowed whatever reply she might have given. The Duke released her hand slowly, bowing with formal courtesy, though his eyes remained fixed on hers a moment longer than propriety strictly required. Elena curtsied in return, her mind still spinning with everything that had just occurred, and as she straightened, she caught sight of Constance across the room, her cousin's face a mask of controlled fury barely concealed beneath a brittle smile, and beside her, Lord Reed's expression had gone cold in a way that made Elena's stomach tighten with a familiar, dreadful sense of consequences yet to come. Margaret appeared at her side almost immediately, steering her gently away from the center of the floor and toward a quieter corner near a set of tall windows. "Well," she said, her eyes bright with something between amusement and concern, "that was certainly not what anyone expected this evening." "I did not expect it either," Elena admitted, her hands still trembling slightly from the encounter. "No," Margaret agreed, glancing across the room toward the Reed family. "But I suspect some people expected something quite different, and they are not taking the disappointment gracefully." Elena followed her gaze and saw Lord Reed already moving toward his daughter, his voice low and urgent, his hand gripping Constance's arm with a tension that suggested the conversation happening between them was far from gentle. Elena felt a flicker of guilt, though she had done nothing to invite the Duke's attention, nothing except sit quietly where she had been told to sit. "This will not end well for me," Elena said softly, more to herself than to Margaret. "Perhaps," Margaret replied, her voice gentle but honest. "Or perhaps, my dear, it will be the beginning of something none of us expected. Either way, you are no longer invisible, and I suspect there is no returning to the shadows now, however much you might wish it." Across the ballroom, Henry Ashby caught Elena's eye and offered a small, knowing smile, before turning back to a conversation with a group of gentlemen near the refreshment table. Elena understood, in that moment, that he had known something of his brother's intentions before the dance had even begun, though what exactly he had known, and why, remained a mystery she had no time to consider. The musicians began a new piece, and the ballroom slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, dancers filling the floor once more, conversations resuming their familiar hum. But Elena could feel the change in the air around her, the weight of dozens of curious glances that had not existed an hour earlier, the whispered speculation that followed her now wherever she moved. She had come to this ball expecting nothing, prepared for another evening of quiet invisibility at the edges of a world that had never fully accepted her. Instead, in the span of a single dance, everything had shifted, and Elena had no way of knowing, as she stood near the tall windows with her heart still racing, whether that shift would bring her closer to the kind of belonging she had quietly longed for, or whether it would bring only new and unfamiliar dangers she was not yet prepared to face. Somewhere behind her, near the refreshment table, Lord Reed's low voice carried just far enough for her to catch a single, chilling fragment. "This is not finished," he said. "Not by far." The carriage ride home was silent in a way that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Elena sat across from her aunt and uncle, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the dark countryside slide past the window, while Constance stared straight ahead with an expression carved from stone. Lord Reed did not speak until the carriage had passed through the gates of their own estate and rolled to a stop before the front steps. Only then did he turn toward Elena, his voice controlled but unmistakably sharp beneath the surface. "You will explain to me," he said, "how a companion brought along to assist my daughter managed to secure the attention of the one man this entire evening was arranged around." "I did nothing, Uncle," Elena said carefully. "I did not seek his attention. I was seated exactly where I was told to remain. And yet he crossed an entire ballroom to reach you." Lord Reed's jaw tightened. "Do you take me for a fool, Elena? Do you imagine I did not notice how you positioned yourself? How you played the quiet, modest creature, while my daughter exhausted herself trying to earn a single glance from that man?" "I did not play anything," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building beneath it. "I sat where I was placed and spoke to no one who did not speak first to me." Constance finally turned, her eyes red-rimmed, though her voice remained cold. "Everyone in that room is laughing at me tonight. Do you understand that? Months of preparation, and the Duke chose the companion instead. My name will be attached to nothing but humiliation by morning." "I am sorry for your embarrassment," Elena said, and meant it, though she could offer nothing more than sympathy for a situation she had never intended to create. "But I did not orchestrate what happened tonight. I could not have predicted it, let alone arranged it." "Predicted or not," Lord Reed said, stepping down from the carriage and turning back with a final, hard look, "you will not attend another event in this family's company. Whatever attention the Duke has shown you tonight will fade quickly enough once he realizes there is no fortune, no family name, nothing behind the pretty face he admired for a single dance. When it does, you will find yourself with considerably less shelter than you currently enjoy. Consider that carefully before you allow yourself any foolish hope." He walked into the house without waiting for a response, and Constance followed a moment later, her skirts sweeping past Elena without a backward glance. Elena remained in the carriage a moment longer, staring at the dark windows of the house that had never truly felt like home, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of the evening pressing down upon her. She had known, somewhere beneath the strange, unexpected warmth of dancing with the Duke, that there would be consequences. She simply had not expected them to arrive so quickly, or to feel quite so much like a threat. Inside her small room at the top of the house, Elena sat by the narrow window long after the household had gone quiet, watching the moon move slowly across a sky scattered with stars, replaying the evening again and again in her mind. The Duke's steady voice, his question about who had told her she did not belong, the careful way he had held her hand, as though it mattered to him whether she felt safe. It would be easy, she thought, to dismiss it all as a passing curiosity on his part, a momentary diversion for a man bored with the predictable performances of eligible young women. Dukes did not typically pursue companions with no fortune and no family name to offer. Whatever had happened on that dance floor was likely nothing more than a brief and inconsequential deviation from his usual indifference. And yet she could not quite make herself believe it. 3 days passed with no word from Ashby Hall, and Elena told herself firmly that this confirmed exactly what she had expected. The Duke had satisfied whatever curiosity had briefly seized him, and life would now return to its familiar rhythm, quiet and unremarkable, exactly as it had been before the ball. Meanwhile, the whispers Lord Reed had feared proved impossible to contain. Word of the Duke's unexpected choice spread quickly through the county, carried by servants and guests alike until it reached every drawing room within a day's ride. Constance found herself the subject of pitying glances wherever she went, her humiliation compounded by the growing rumors that painted Elena, unfairly, as some manner of scheming opportunist who had somehow engineered the entire encounter. "They are saying you flattered your way into his attention," Constance reported coldly one evening, finding Elena in the small sitting room, where she often sat mending linens to earn her keep, "that you positioned yourself deliberately, knowing he would notice a woman dressed so plainly among all the finery." "That is not what happened," Elena said quietly, though she had learned, over 2 years in this house, that defending herself rarely accomplished much. It does not matter what happened, Constance snapped. It matters what people believe. And right now, half the county believes I was outmaneuvered by my own cousin at a ball my father spent a fortune arranging. Elena set down her needle and looked at her cousin directly, something in her finally refusing to accept blame for circumstances entirely outside her control. I did not ask him to choose me, Constance. I did not want any of this. If you wish to be angry with someone, perhaps direct that anger toward the man who made the choice, rather than the woman who never sought it. Constance's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at Elena's uncharacteristic firmness, but she said nothing further, turning instead and leaving the room with her skirt snapping sharply behind her. Later that same afternoon, Elena's aunt found her in the hallway and stopped her with a hand on her arm, her expression a strange mixture of irritation and something almost like reluctant curiosity. "Tell me honestly," she said, glancing over her shoulder to be certain they were not overheard. "Did he say anything to you that night? Anything that explained why he chose you over every other woman in that room?" Elena considered how much to share, uncertain whether honesty would help or harm her position within the household. "He said very little, Aunt. Only that he found the room exhausting, and that I seemed the only person in it not performing for his benefit." Her aunt's expression flickered, something almost wistful crossing her features before she composed herself again. "That does sound like him. I remember hearing the same complaints about ballroom performances from his mother, years ago, before she passed. She used to say her son inherited his father's patience for honesty and precious little tolerance for flattery." She studied Elena for a long moment. "You would do well to remember that patience does not last forever, whatever kindness he has shown you so far." The warning, however gently delivered, settled uneasily in Elena's chest as she returned to her small room that evening, turning the day's events over in her mind, long after the house had gone quiet around her. Alone again, Elena returned to her mending, though her hands moved without her full attention, her mind still circling back, as it had every day since the ball, to the Duke's steady eyes and the quiet strength of his voice. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a single dance, foolish to imagine that a man of his position and reputation would think of her again once the initial curiosity had faded. But 4 days after the ball, a letter arrived. It came not through the front door, addressed formally to the household, but through Margaret, who appeared unannounced one afternoon with a small folded note tucked carefully into her glove. She found Elena in the garden, escaping the tension of the house for a few quiet moments among the roses, and pressed the letter into her hand with a knowing smile. "He asked that I deliver this discreetly," Margaret said. "I gather he did not wish to cause you further difficulty with your family." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was precise, controlled, exactly as she might have expected from a man who carried himself with such careful composure. "Miss Whitmore," the letter began, "I have thought of little else since our dance, and I confess this troubles me greatly, as I am not a man accustomed to being troubled by thoughts of anyone. I would very much like the opportunity to speak with you again, away from the eyes and whispers of a crowded ballroom. If you are willing, I will be walking the eastern path near the old stone bridge tomorrow at 11 in the morning. I will understand entirely if you do not come. Nathaniel Ashby." Elena read the letter twice, her heart beating unsteadily, before folding it carefully and pressing it against her chest as though it might disappear if she did not hold it close. "Well," Margaret said, watching her expression with evident satisfaction, "it seems the cold Duke of Ashby is not quite so cold after all." "I do not know if I should go," Elena admitted, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. "My uncle has forbidden further contact. If he learns of this, the consequences could be severe."
"Your uncle has already shown you exactly what kind of shelter he offers," Margaret said gently. "Perhaps it is time to consider what you truly want, rather than what you have been told to accept."
"You are a grown woman, Elena, not a possession to be managed for someone else's convenience." Elena looked down at the letter once more, tracing the careful lines of his handwriting, and felt something shift within her, some small and long-buried part of herself daring, for the first time in years, to hope for more than mere survival. "I will go," she said quietly, more to herself than to Margaret. "Tomorrow, at 11. Margaret smiled and squeezed her hand warmly. "Then I shall make certain you are not missed at home for a few hours. Some things, my dear, are worth the risk." That night, Elena lay awake long past midnight, the letter tucked safely beneath her pillow, her mind turning over every possibility the coming day might hold. She did not know what the Duke intended to say to her, did not know whether this quiet meeting would lead to something lasting, or simply another brief and painful reminder of a life she was not permitted to have. But for the first time since the fire had taken everything from her, Elena felt something stir inside her chest that was neither grief nor resignation. It felt, unmistakably, like hope. And somewhere across the county, in a grand house far removed from the small room where Elena lay awake beneath borrowed shelter, Lord Reed sat late into the night with a glass of brandy untouched before him, turning over his own plans with far less hopeful intentions, determined that whatever the Duke of Ashby imagined he had found at that ball, it would not be permitted to flourish without a fight. The eastern path wound gently through a stretch of woodland before opening onto a wide meadow, where an old stone bridge crossed a narrow stream, its surface worn smooth by generations of quiet footsteps. Elena arrived a few minutes before 11, her heart racing as much from nerves as from the brisk walk she had taken to avoid drawing attention from the house. She found him already waiting, standing near the center of the bridge with his hands resting on the weathered stone railing, his gaze fixed on the water below. He wore no formal coat today, nothing to announce his title or his wealth, simply a plain dark jacket that made him seem, for the first time since Elena had encountered him, almost approachable. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression eased visibly, as though he had genuinely doubted whether she would come. "Miss Whitmore," he said, straightening, "I confess I was uncertain you would honor my request." "I nearly did not," Elena admitted, stopping a respectful distance away. "My uncle has made his feelings on the matter quite clear." "I imagined he might." The Duke's jaw tightened briefly. "I am sorry to have caused you difficulty at home. That was never my intention. You did not force me to dance with you, Your Grace. Whatever difficulty has followed is not entirely your doing." He studied her for a long moment, and Elena found herself unable to look away, caught by the quiet intensity in his expression, so different from the cold distance she had witnessed him show the rest of the ballroom that night. "Please," he said finally, "call me Nathaniel, when we are away from prying eyes. I find I would rather hear my own name from you than another title I have grown tired of carrying." "That seems a rather significant request for someone we met only days ago," Elena said, though there was no real resistance in her voice. "Perhaps. But I have not stopped thinking of you since that dance, and formality feels rather absurd under the circumstances." He gestured toward the low wall bordering the bridge, an invitation to sit, and Elena accepted, settling beside him with the stream murmuring gently below. "May I ask you something, Nathaniel?" She tested the name carefully, and something flickered across his face, warm and pleased, at the sound of it. "Anything?" "Why me? There were dozens of women at that ball, women far better suited to your position than a companion with no fortune, and no family name worth mentioning. I do not understand what you saw in me that made you cross an entire room." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with the same careful precision he seemed to bring to everything. "I have spent 3 years attending events exactly like that one," he said finally. "Every woman who approaches me does so with the same calculated performance, the same practiced laugh, the same careful positioning meant to draw my attention. It grows exhausting, being seen only as a title to be won, rather than a person to be known. And you believed I was different? You were the only person in that entire room not performing for anyone. You sat quietly, watching everything with such careful attention, asking nothing of the evening except perhaps to be left alone. There was an honesty in that stillness I had not encountered in a very long time." He turned to look at her directly. "I wanted to know the woman behind that stillness. I still do." Elena felt warmth rise in her chest, unfamiliar, and slightly overwhelming after so many years of guarding herself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. "My circumstances are not what you might imagine," she said carefully. "My parents died 2 years ago, in a fire that took our home along with everything we owned. I have lived since then on my uncle's charity, and charity, I have learned, always comes with conditions attached." "I am sorry for your loss," Nathaniel said, and the simplicity of the words, free of pity or performance, meant more to Elena than any elaborate condolence might have. "Grief has a way of teaching us things we would never have chosen to learn. I understand something of that myself, though my own loss came differently." "Your father," Elena said softly, remembering what Margaret had told her. "Yes, a sudden death, and I was left with a title and a household I was not prepared to manage, along with a great many people who suddenly wished to know me, far better than they ever had while my father was alive." His voice carried a quiet bitterness beneath its steadiness. "It taught me quickly who valued me, and who valued only what I could offer them." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the stream continuing its gentle murmur beneath them, and Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at ease in another person's company. My uncle believes, she said eventually, that whatever interest you have shown will fade once you fully understand I have nothing to offer you. No fortune, no useful family connections, nothing that would benefit a man in your position. Your uncle is mistaken, Nathaniel said firmly, if he believes those are the qualities I am seeking in a companion, or in a wife. He paused, seeming to realize the weight of what he had just implied, though he did not retreat from it. Forgive me, that was perhaps too forward for a second meeting. It is refreshing, actually, Elena said, surprising herself with her own honesty. I have grown accustomed to people wanting things from me, or wanting nothing from me at all except my silence and obedience. I do not know quite what to make of someone who seems to want simply to know me. Then perhaps we shall discover it together, Nathaniel said, and something in his tone suggested a promise rather than a passing sentiment. Tell me about your household, Elena said, eager to understand the world he inhabited beyond the cold reputation others had described to her. Henry seems fond of you, despite what people say about your temperament. Nathaniel allowed a small, genuine laugh, the sound unfamiliar and pleasant. Henry is the only person who has never once treated me differently because of the title. He teases me mercilessly for my seriousness, though I suspect he understands better than anyone why I guard myself so carefully around others. We lost our mother young, and our father shortly after I came of age. Henry and I have only ever truly had each other since. That sounds lonely, Elena said softly. It was, for a time, though I have found, since meeting you, that loneliness feels somewhat less permanent than I once believed it to be. He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering across his usually composed features. I have not spoken so openly with anyone in a very long while, Elena. I hope you will forgive me if I seem unpracticed at it. There is nothing to forgive, she said. I find I much prefer this honesty to any of the polished conversation I overheard at the ball. They spoke for nearly an hour, covering subjects both light and serious, and Elena found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, surprised by how easily conversation flowed once the initial nervousness had faded. Nathaniel asked about her childhood, about the small details of a life before tragedy had reshaped it, and listened with genuine attention rather than the polite impatience she had grown used to from her aunt and uncle. As the sun climbed higher, Elena reluctantly rose from the wall, aware that her absence from the house would soon draw notice if she did not return. I should go, she said, before my uncle grows suspicious. Nathaniel stood as well, and for a moment neither of them moved to leave, the space between them charged with something neither had yet named aloud. May I write to you again, properly, through Margaret, until circumstances allow for something more open? I would like that, Elena said, and meant it fully. He walked her partway back toward the edge of the meadow before parting ways, and Elena returned home with her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember, entirely unaware of the quiet figure watching from the tree line at the far edge of the path, a hired man in plain clothing, who had followed her that morning at Lord Reed's instruction, and who now turned back toward the estate to deliver his report. That evening Lord Reed summoned Elena to his study, his expression carefully controlled in a way that immediately put her on alert. I understand you took a walk this morning, he said, his voice deceptively calm, along the eastern path, I believe. Elena's stomach tightened, though she kept her expression steady. I enjoy walking, Uncle. There is nothing unusual in that. Do not insult my intelligence, Elena. I know exactly who you met, and I will not have this family's reputation further damaged by whatever foolish romance you imagine is developing between yourself and the Duke of Ashby. He rose from his desk, his voice hardening. You will end whatever correspondence has begun, and you will do so immediately. I am not a child to be commanded, Uncle, and I am not property to be managed for your convenience. Elena's voice trembled slightly, but she did not back down, surprising herself with the strength of her own resolve. You have provided me shelter, and I am grateful for it, but you do not control who I choose to know or care for. Lord Reed's face darkened with fury at her defiance, a response so unfamiliar from the quiet, obedient niece he had grown accustomed to, that it seemed to catch him briefly off guard. You will regret this defiance, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. I promise you that. Elena left the study with her hands shaking, uncertain what consequences her uncle intended to pursue, but resolved, for the first time since her parents' deaths, not to let fear dictate every choice she made. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, she would face them, and she would not do so by abandoning the small, fragile hope that had begun to bloom within her since that first unexpected dance. Unbeknownst to Elena, Lord Reed spent that same evening drafting a letter of his own, one intended not for her, but for a contact he maintained in the city. A man skilled in gathering information that could be twisted into scandal. Information that might be used to ensure the Duke of Ashby reconsidered his sudden and inconvenient interest in a penniless companion, before that interest could develop into anything more permanent. The following days brought no word from Ashby Hall, and Elena began to fear that her uncle's threats, however vague, had somehow already borne consequences she could not yet see. She continued her daily routines with outward composure, mending linens, assisting with household tasks, enduring Constance's cold silence and her aunt's pointed disapproval, all while carrying the weight of uncertainty about what her uncle might be planning in the shadows. It was Henry who finally brought news, arriving at the house under the pretense of delivering a message from his mother to Elena's aunt, though he found a private moment to press a folded note into Elena's hand as he departed. "My brother asked me to deliver this personally," he said quietly. He did not trust it to Margaret this time. "Something has changed, and he wished you to hear it directly from someone he trusts." Elena waited until she was alone in her room before unfolding the letter, her hands trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Elena," it began, without the formal address he had used before, "I have learned that your uncle has been making inquiries in the city, gathering information he intends to use against you, or perhaps against me, though I suspect the true target is our connection itself. I do not yet know the full extent of what he seeks to uncover, but I wanted you to hear this from me before it reaches you through crueler means. Whatever he finds, whatever lies or half-truths he attempts to spread, know that my regard for you has not wavered, and will not waver, regardless of what schemes are set against us. Please be careful. I will find a way to see you again soon. Nathaniel." Elena read the letter twice, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt remarkably like determination. Her uncle's threats had always carried weight because she had nowhere else to turn, no other shelter to seek if his charity was withdrawn. But for the first time she found herself less afraid of losing that shelter than she was determined not to lose the fragile, precious connection that had begun to give her life meaning beyond mere survival. Whatever scheme Lord Reed intended to set in motion, Elena resolved, she would not face it by retreating back into silence and invisibility. She had spent 2 years making herself small enough to avoid notice, careful enough to avoid conflict, quiet enough to avoid becoming a burden. That version of herself, she realized with growing clarity, was not one she wished to return to, not now that she had glimpsed what it felt like to be truly seen. The scandal broke 3 days later, spreading through the county with the particular speed reserved for stories that combine wealth, romance, and ruin in equal measure. Elena first learned of it when her aunt burst into the small sitting room, a printed sheet clutched in her hand, her face pale with fury and something that might have been fear. "Explain this," her aunt demanded, thrusting the paper toward Elena. Elena took it with trembling hands and read the words that had been carefully arranged to cause maximum damage. The account claimed, with false confidence, that Elena Whitmore had a history of manipulating wealthy families for personal gain, that her parents had not died in a tragic fire at all but had abandoned her due to scandalous behavior, and that her sudden appearance at Lord Reed's ball had been a calculated scheme to trap the Duke of Ashby into a disadvantageous match. None of it was true. Every word had been twisted or invented entirely, but Elena understood immediately, with sickening clarity, exactly who had orchestrated its creation. "This is a lie," Elena said, her voice shaking with anger she had rarely allowed herself to express. "Every word of it is false." "It does not matter whether it is true," her aunt snapped. "It is already spreading through every drawing room in the county. Do you understand what you have done to this family's reputation?" "I have done nothing," Elena said, finally allowing the full force of her frustration to surface. "I did not write these lies. I did not spread them. I have done nothing, except exist quietly in this house for 2 years, grateful for shelter I was made to feel I did not deserve." Her voice broke slightly, though she pushed through the emotion rather than retreating from it. "If you wish to find the source of this scandal, Uncle's study would be a reasonable place to begin looking." Her aunt's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition, though she said nothing further, turning instead to leave the room with the printed sheet still clutched in her hand. Elena sat alone for a long while afterward, the weight of the false accusations pressing heavily upon her, wondering how far the lies had already spread, wondering whether Nathaniel had heard them yet, wondering whether even a man who had spoken so confidently of his regard for her could withstand a scandal of this magnitude without his own reputation suffering alongside hers. She did not have to wonder long. That afternoon a carriage arrived at the estate bearing the Ashby crest, drawing immediate attention from every window in the house. Elena watched from her small room as Nathaniel himself stepped down, his expression set with a grim determination that carried none of the gentle warmth she had come to associate with their private conversations. She hurried downstairs, arriving just as her uncle emerged from his study to greet the unexpected guest with false cordiality that did little to mask his obvious discomfort. "Your Grace," Lord Reed said, bowing stiffly. "This is an unexpected honor." "I imagine it is," Nathaniel replied, his voice carrying none of the warmth Elena had heard directed toward her. "I have come regarding a rather troubling piece of writing that has found its way into circulation this week, one containing a great many claims about Miss Whitmore that I have reason to believe are entirely false." Lord Reed's composure flickered, though he recovered quickly. "I am afraid I know nothing of such matters, Your Grace. Rumors spread through the county with regularity, and I could not begin to trace their origins." "Could you not?" Nathaniel's voice remained level, but there was an edge beneath it now, sharp and unmistakable. "I have made some inquiries of my own since this account began circulating. It seems a man matching your description made several visits to a printer in the city known for producing exactly this sort of material, timed rather precisely to follow shortly after your daughter's disappointment at my family's ball." The color drained from Lord Reed's face, though he attempted, unconvincingly, to maintain his denial. "I do not know what you imagine you have discovered, Your Grace, but I assure you—" "Save your assurances," Nathaniel said, his voice growing colder still. "I have no interest in pursuing legal consequences for this scheme, though I would be well within my rights to do so. What I require instead is a public retraction, issued through the same channels that spread these lies, correcting the record entirely, and restoring Miss Whitmore's reputation without qualification." Elena stood frozen at the base of the stairs, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of astonishment and something that felt dangerously close to hope. She had expected, in her darkest moments over the past few days, that Nathaniel might quietly withdraw his interest rather than risk his own standing over a scandal not of his making. Instead, he stood before her uncle with unwavering resolve, defending her honor with the same quiet steadiness he had shown from their very first conversation. "And if I refuse?" Lord Reed asked, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Then I will make it my personal mission to ensure every family of consequence in this county understands precisely what kind of man you are, and precisely what lengths you are willing to pursue, to protect a scheme built on deception, rather than genuine regard for your family's welfare." Nathaniel's gaze did not waver. "I do not believe that outcome would serve your interests, or your daughter's, particularly well." Lord Reed's jaw tightened, and for a long moment the study fell into tense silence. Finally, with visible reluctance, he inclined his head in a stiff nod. "I will see to it that a retraction is issued. Within the week," Nathaniel said firmly. "I will be confirming its publication myself." As Lord Reed retreated back into his study, visibly shaken by the confrontation, Nathaniel turned toward the base of the stairs, and his expression softened immediately at the sight of Elena standing there, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, once they had stepped outside into the relative privacy of the garden. "I did," Nathaniel replied simply. "I told you my regard for you would not waver, whatever schemes were set against us. I intend to keep that promise, regardless of the difficulties it may cause." "Even knowing what such a connection might cost you, your reputation, your standing among people who value calculation over genuine feeling?" "Elena," he said her name softly, without any title attached, and something in his tone made her breath catch. "I have spent years surrounded by people who valued my title far more than my character, who performed affection they did not feel in pursuit of advantages they believed my position could offer them. You have never once asked me for anything. You have never performed for my benefit, never calculated how best to secure my favor. That honesty is worth far more to me than any reputation I might risk in defending it." Elena felt tears rise unexpectedly, the accumulated weight of 2 years of quiet loneliness finally beginning to loosen beneath the warmth of being genuinely valued for exactly who she was, without condition or calculation. "I do not know how to thank you properly," she said. "You need not thank me at all," Nathaniel replied, reaching gently for her hand. "I would ask instead that you allow me to continue proving, through actions rather than mere words, that whatever future you choose to build, you need not build it alone any longer." They stood together in the quiet garden as the afternoon light softened toward evening, and Elena, for the first time since the fire that had taken her family and her home, allowed herself to believe fully that better days might genuinely lie ahead. That the invisibility she had endured for so long might finally be giving way to something far more lasting than a single unexpected dance. The retraction was published within the week, exactly as Nathaniel had promised, restoring Elena's reputation and exposing Lord Reed's scheme to a county already primed to gossip about the dramatic reversal. Constance, humiliated further by her father's exposed deception, withdrew from society for a time, though whatever resentment lingered between the cousins gradually softened as the weeks passed and the scandal faded into old news. Margaret visited often during those weeks, delighting openly in the way circumstances had unfolded, teasing Elena gently about how quickly a single dance had reshaped the course of her entire life. "I told you, did I not?" she said one afternoon, settling into a chair in the garden with evident satisfaction, "that this would be the beginning of something none of us expected." "You did," Elena admitted, smiling, "though I confess I did not believe you at the time." "Few people believe good fortune when it finally arrives," Margaret said, patting her hand affectionately. "We grow so accustomed to bracing for disappointment that happiness, when it comes, feels almost unfamiliar. I am glad you allowed yourself to trust it, my dear, even when trusting felt like the harder choice." Henry, too, remained a constant presence throughout those weeks, visiting often under increasingly transparent excuses, clearly delighted by the transformation in his brother's demeanor. "I have not seen him laugh this often in years," he confided to Elena one evening, watching Nathaniel across the room with open affection. "Whatever you have done, Miss Whitmore, I hope you intend to keep doing it." "I intend to try," Elena replied, watching Nathaniel in turn, still faintly astonished by how naturally warmth had returned to a man so many had once dismissed as unreachably cold. Nathaniel continued visiting the estate openly now, his intentions no longer requiring secrecy or discretion, and Lord Reed, having lost whatever leverage he once held, offered no further resistance to a connection that had proven, through fire and false accusation alike, far stronger than mere convenience or calculation could ever have produced. Spring arrived slowly that year, easing the county out of a long winter with warm mornings, and fields turning green along the eastern path where Elena and Nathaniel had first spoken freely with one another. Elena walked that same path often now, though she no longer walked it in secret, no longer glanced over her shoulder for hired men reporting her movements back to a man who had once controlled so much of her fate. Much had changed since that first dance. Nathaniel had proposed formally in early spring, not in a crowded ballroom filled with whispering guests, but on the stone bridge where their quiet friendship had first taken root, the same murmuring stream beneath them as he knelt, and asked whether she would agree to spend the rest of her life beside a man who had once believed himself too guarded ever to want such a thing again. Elena had said yes without hesitation, tears gathering in her eyes as she finally allowed herself to fully believe that the aching loneliness of the past 2 years had truly given way to something lasting. The wedding itself was modest by the standards of Ashby Hall's usual grandeur, held in the small chapel near the estate, rather than the elaborate cathedral many had expected for a duke's marriage. Nathaniel had insisted on simplicity, understanding without needing to be told that Elena would feel more comfortable surrounded by genuine warmth than empty spectacle. Margaret stood proudly among the small gathering of guests, her eyes bright with tears as she watched the daughter of her old friend find happiness she had feared might never come. Henry served as his brother's groomsman, grinning throughout the ceremony with the satisfaction of a man who had quietly suspected, from that very first night, exactly how the story would unfold. Even Constance attended, her presence a quiet acknowledgement that whatever rivalry had once existed between the cousins had softened into something closer to understanding. The scandal her father had orchestrated had cost the Reed family dearly in social standing, and Lord Reed himself, humbled by the consequences of his own scheming, had grown notably quieter in the months that followed, no longer attempting to control outcomes that had always, in truth, belonged to Elena alone. In the months following their marriage, Elena settled into her new life at Ashby Hall with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She had spent so long believing that happiness belonged to other people, to women born into privilege and certainty, that she found herself occasionally waiting for the fragile new life to dissolve, as suddenly as it had begun. But each morning brought fresh confirmation that this happiness was real, solid, unshakable, in ways her earlier years of loss had taught her never to expect. Nathaniel proved, in the quiet privacy of daily life, to be nothing like the cold, distant figure society had once believed him to be. He listened when Elena spoke, truly listened, remembering small details of her thoughts and preferences that others might have dismissed as unimportant. He encouraged her interests, supported her quiet efforts to assist tenant families on the estate who reminded her, in some small way, of her own family's earlier struggles, and never once made her feel as though her worth depended on anything beyond the simple fact of who she was. Elena also found unexpected purpose in the months following her marriage, spending many mornings visiting tenant families across the estate, listening to their concerns and helping arrange practical support where it was needed most. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to be overlooked by those with the power to help, and she resolved that no one within her new reach would suffer that same quiet invisibility if she could offer them anything different. Nathaniel, rather than discouraging these efforts, often accompanied her, learning names and circumstances he confessed he had never fully understood before, despite having managed the estate for years. "You see people more clearly than I ever learned to," he told her one afternoon, as they walked back from a modest cottage, where an elderly widow had thanked them both with tears in her eyes for arranging repairs to her roof before winter arrived. "I spent so many years guarding myself against people who wanted only my title, that I forgot how to simply notice the ones who wanted nothing at all." "You are learning now," Elena said gently. "That is what matters." Constance, too, found her own path forward in the months that followed, gradually setting aside the bitterness that had once defined her toward her cousin. A quiet correspondence developed between them, tentative at first, then warmer, until Constance arrived unannounced one afternoon simply to talk, admitting with visible difficulty that she had spent years measuring her own worth against the approval of others, and that watching Elena find happiness without any of the calculation Constance had once believed necessary had forced her to reconsider a great many assumptions about what genuine contentment actually required. "I am sorry," Constance said quietly, during that visit, "for how unkind I was, before I understood what you were truly facing in that house. We were both doing what we believed we had to survive circumstances neither of us chose," Elena replied, and found, to her own quiet relief, that she meant the forgiveness fully. One evening, nearly a year after that first unexpected dance, Elena stood once again in the grand ballroom of Ashby Hall, though this time the occasion was an anniversary celebration, rather than the tense, calculated gathering it had once been. The room glittered with the same candlelight, the same swirl of gowns and careful conversation, but Elena no longer sat quietly at the edges, waiting to be overlooked. Nathaniel found her near the tall windows, exactly where he had first noticed her stillness among the crowd, and extended his hand with a small, genuine smile that had become far more common in the months since their marriage. "May I have this dance, my Duchess?" Elena laughed softly, placing her hand in his without hesitation, the same steady warmth she had felt on that very first evening still present, though deepened now by months of genuine partnership and understanding. "I believe you may, Your Grace." They moved together onto the floor as the musicians began to play, and this time, when the crowd turned to watch, there was no shock in their expressions, no scandalized whispers rippling through the room. There was only quiet admiration for a couple who had found, against considerable odds, something far more valuable than any calculated match arranged for advantage or convenience. Elena thought back, as they turned slowly beneath the glittering chandeliers, to the frightened young woman who had once sat invisible near a cluster of white flowers, certain that evenings like this one belonged only to other people, certain that her own quiet presence would forever go unnoticed and unwanted. She thought of the fire that had taken everything from her, of the years of careful, guarded survival that had followed, of the countless moments when hope had felt like a luxury she could not afford. None of that pain had disappeared entirely. Grief and loss, she had learned, did not simply vanish once happiness arrived to replace them, but she had discovered, through Nathaniel's steady patience and genuine regard, that it was possible to carry both, to hold the memory of what had been lost alongside the reality of what had finally been found. As the dance drew to its close, Nathaniel drew her slightly closer, his voice low and warm against her ear. "Do you remember what you told me, that very first night, about watching being safer than performing?" "I remember," Elena said softly. "I am glad you chose eventually to stop merely watching." His hand tightened gently around hers. "I am endlessly grateful you allowed yourself, that night, to finally be seen." Elena smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as the music faded into a gentle round of applause around them. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the ballroom, the same stars that had once watched over a lonely, overlooked young woman now shone down upon a duchess who had finally, fully, found the place where she belonged. The path from invisibility to belonging had not been easy, marked as it was by loss, scandal, and quiet courage in the face of those who sought to keep her small. But Elena understood now, standing in the warm circle of her husband's arms, that every difficult step had led her exactly where she was always meant to be, not through fortune or family name, but through the simple, unshakable truth of being genuinely known and genuinely chosen, not for what she could offer, but for exactly who she was. And in that truth she found not just happiness, but a lasting sense of home she had once feared she would never know again.